UFC Fight Night, Hall versus Strickland, aka UFC Vegas 33. Welcome to another UFC prediction and analysis video by yours truly here at Boxing MMA Picks. Boxing MMA Picks, we are here to give you our fight by fight breakdown, specifically from the betting perspective, letting you know which fights are worth the value, which fights you want to stay away from, perhaps which underdog or two has a shot at winning. And if you stick around to the end of the video, you may even get a little bit of parlay action as well. Harris flying solo today. No Zan for this one, but he will be back next week. But we got to get the picks to the people. So I'm going to fly solo on this one. Very busy card, respectfully, a low-level card. Uriah Hall, Sean Strickland being our main event for this UFC Fight Night. We have 15 fights in total. So I'm going to get right to work with fight number one. Ryan Benoit taking on Zarrukh Adashev. And looking at Ryan Benoit, I mean, pretty decent overall, well-rounded fighter. Good boxing, good in and out movement. He's a patient striker, pretty crisp kicks as well. I like his takedown defense, has some wrestling ability. Again, just kind of an overall solid fighter all around. The thing with Ryan Benoit, however, is that he finds himself in a lot of close fights. You see there, he lost via unanimous decision to Tim Elliott, lost a split decision to Haile Alateng. Always seems to find himself in one of those close fight type of situations. So, don't look for him to necessarily blow the water out on this one. Zarrukh Adashev, on the other hand, 0-2 in the UFC. We see his two fights. Su Maderji also lost to Tyson Nam via KO TKO. You might think to yourself, okay, this is a fighter who's 3-3. Doesn't really have any quality wins on his resume per se. If we take a look at his record here, just not really taking on anyone with any real amount of experience. And of course, when he did do that in Tyson Nam and Su Maderji, he lost both of those fights. So that is a little concerning on his end. But to his point, he is a pretty decent striker, high level striker, somebody who probably could make some noise in the UFC, but just really got off to the wrong foot. Ultimately, when I look at this fight, hard to really say who's going to win. Adashev is going to have the better stand-up. Benoit is going to be perhaps the better all-around fighter. And Benoit, neither of these fighters, I should say, have been reliable in the UFC. Really hard to make a pick from that perspective. But what I will say is that I'm slightly going to lean on the side of Benoit. Given the fact that he does have that UFC experience, he does have some UFC wins on his resume, and I just look for him to get the job done, being the slightly more diverse fighter. But what I will say is this is definitely a fight that I'm not interested in betting in. The odds are very close. This one could go either way in a lot of ways, and I'm definitely going to stay away from the betting perspective. Let's move on to fight number two. We have Phil Rowe, the plus 145 underdog, taking on Orion Cosce. I'll start with a Cosce on this one. He's undefeated, 7-0, making his UFC debut after winning on Dana White Contender Series. That was via KO TKO back in August 2020. All 7 of his wins are by finish. 6 of them are by KO TKO. 1 of them is by submission. Southpaw on the feet. I've seen him switch stance as well. Pretty patient in the stand-up. Decent movement, although he is a little flat-footed, in my opinion. He definitely comes forward a lot, has some pop in his punches, sometimes overdoes it, sometimes puts a little bit too much power into it, mixes in the kicks really well as well. So going to give you a pretty diverse stand-up game. From a wrestling perspective, he's a state champion, right? So he is comfortable if he is taken down. He can scramble, he can find his way back up. Decent control in the clinch, decent ability to land the takedown, decent top control. But one thing with him, you see with his physical stature, not too impressed by his cardio. As the fight goes on, he definitely slows down. If I'm looking at Philip Rowe, on the other hand, the Fresh Prince, he lost in his UFC debut. That was to Gabe Green back in February. Pretty tall fighter, 6'3". He's definitely going to have the height advantage by 4 inches. Going to have the reach advantage by almost 10 inches as well. So look for him to be the taller, longer fighter. A lot of movement coming out of him. Relaxed in the stand-up, keeps a good range. Good long jab, long straight combinations, fights from the outside, includes those kicks in there on a regular basis as well. Pretty good top game, good ground game in general. He is a BJJ brown belt, so he does have some knowledge on the ground. Grapples with some high level fighters in his gym. So definitely used to being on the ground there. Philip Rowe, though, he's been touched in his last few fights. I'm not necessarily saying the chin is suspect, but Cosce is a big swinger, right? Cosce could catch him, and Philip Rowe has been wobbled in his past few fights. So I can see that potentially being a threat in this fight. Ultimately, you want to ask yourself from a perspective of what you think will happen. Can Rowe fight effectively from the outside and be effective in this fight? Can Cosce press forward the same way that Gabe Green did against Philip Rowe? I don't necessarily think Cosce can do that. I look at Gabe Green by comparison as somebody that has a little bit more footwork and a little bit more pace to him when comparing both of those fighters coming forward. I don't necessarily think Cosce can do that. I don't think, again, he has that footwork. I don't think he's as fast as Gabe Green was, but I do expect him to be coming forward. Also, I do think that Philip Rowe will make some adjustments from his debut. At the very least, I look at Rowe as a pretty live underdog. I can't see any one glaring advantage for either fighter, although, again, Orion Cosce should have did better wrestling. Phil Rowe is pretty comfortable on his back with his grappling ability. So, in a lot of ways, this is somewhat a 50-50 fight. So to some degree, I'm going to go with some Vegas logic here. If I see the plus 145 underdog taking on the minus 170 favorite, and I can't have any reason to specifically swing in any one way or the other, I'm going to go with the underdog. So in this case, Phil Rowe is going to be my pick. I'm going to move on to fight number 3. We have Ronnie Lawrence taking on Trevin Jones. I'm going to start with Trevin Jones. Pretty good win versus Mario Batista. That was in his last fight back in March. A pretty well-rounded fighter. We initially saw how good his stand-up was versus Timur Valiev. He showed it again in that Mario Batista fight. Good kickboxing, decent hands, southpaw on the feet, good movement, good striking defense, good combinations, pretty good pace, and definitely willing to engage. And I do like his clinch. I like his wrestling, and he's also a BJJ black belt. So again, one of these really, well-rounded fighters in the bantamweight division. Looking at Ronnie Lawrence, on the other hand, he won his debut back in February. That was versus Vince Cachero. You're going to see a lot of movement coming out of Ronnie Lawrence. In the stand-up, a lot of circling around the cage, a lot of stance switch. Almost has that awkward Dom Cruz style of stand-up at times. And I really like his kicks, really effective calf kick. That's something that he turns to often. And that's something that has been very effective for him in his fights as well. And again, speaking of a pretty good overall fighter here, Ronnie Lawrence has good wrestling. He'll find a way to keep you on the ground. He'll chain wrestle. He'll look for those takedowns. He has pretty good takedowns. And again, from a grappling perspective, he's a BJJ brown belt. And one thing that's really important to note as well with Ronnie Lawrence, with that awkward style, that cardio and that pace, it seems to hold up for the entire fight. So this is a really tough fight, in my opinion, a really interesting fight. We see the odds are pretty close on paper. Interesting to know with Trevin Jones. I mean, he's performed pretty well as an underdog in the UFC. Looking at his last few fights, again, Timur Valiev, he was an underdog. Mario Batista, he was an underdog. And then this week versus Ronnie Lawrence, he's an underdog again. So, can he perform again as the underdog? We're going to have to see. I can see Trevin Jones having some issues with Ronnie Lawrence's movement, at least early in the fight. But my gut is saying Trevin Jones. It's hard to go against Ronnie Lawrence. Ronnie Lawrence probably pulls out the victory, but my gut is telling me to go with the underdog again. I think Jones can possibly touch him. I mean, I want to see how Ronnie Lawrence reacts to that, right? I mean, again, I think about that Trevin Jones versus Timur Valiev fight where Valiev was looking pretty good. Jones touched him. The fight was basically over. And I mean, again, we're seeing Jones here as the underdog at plus 120. So I can definitely see some value in that. Not surprised if Ronnie Lawrence pulls it out. but I'm going to take a stab at the underdog, and Trevin Jones is going to be my pick for this one. So back-to-back underdogs, looking at fights number 2 and 3. In that case, I'm going to go to fight number 4, Jinh Frey taking on Ashley Yoder. Now for this fight, Ashley Yoder, I mean, she lost to Angela Hill. That was back in March. Of course, that was a rematch, pretty outclassed in that fight. I think that was a pretty bad matchup for her. When she is introduced in the ring, she's introduced as a BJJ practitioner and as a Muay Thai fighter. So that is going to tell you, quite a bit about what you can expect from her. She's a southpaw on the feet, a lot of fakes, some feints, doesn't really have the quickest hands. Same thing with her feet, doesn't really have the quickest feet either. Almost looks like Ashley Yoder's kind of moving at a sparring pace on the feet. And that's not something that you can be too confident in from a betting perspective. I do see some takedown defense from her. Of course, we know she is a grappler, pretty comfortable on her back. She'll shoot for the triangles, she'll go for chokes, but I'm not too confident in her cardio. Not really much else to say about Ashley Yoder beyond that. Looking at Jinh Frey, on the other hand, she's coming off of a unanimous decision win in her last fight, a pretty impressive win versus Gloria DePaula. That was on the same fight card that Ashley Yoder was on, and that was actually her first UFC win. She's a southpaw as well, so definitely look for that southpaw versus southpaw matchup. Decent skill set on paper. She can definitely play that clinch game against the cage. She's shown me, Jinh Frey has shown me some takedown ability with some top control as well. Decent tie clinch in general, right? She has a decent left straight as well on the feet. And again, I've seen her with some decent takedown defense. I've also seen her control the center of the octagon on the feet. So again, it's tough to say with these two fighters, because as much things as I could say about Jinh Frey, neither fighter really impresses me. You look at both of these fighters' records, Ashley Yoder at 8-7, Jinh Frey at 10-6. That's going to tell you that neither fighter has been consistent throughout their career. So I'll keep this short. I mean, I think for as inconsistent as they both are, I think Jinh Frey just has a little bit more to offer. I think she's a little tougher. I think she's willing to engage a little bit more on the feet. I think she's possibly just as capable on the ground and probably better on the ground offensively. So I think Jinh Frey just has a little bit more to offer, coming off of a pretty decent win versus Gloria DePaula, who we will mention in our main card video. So I think she gets the job done here today versus Ashley Yoder. Moving on to fight number 5, Danny Chavez taking on Kai Kamaka III. Pretty decent fight here. This one's going to be a decently entertaining one. Danny Chavez, he lost to Jared Gordon back in February. Looking at Danny Chavez on the feet, pretty quick in his strikes. Quick hands, quick spin kicks, good hand speed in general, and definitely has some pop in his hands as well. He uses that calf kick really often, so that's going to be very important to note to see how Kai Kamaka handles that. But he is a patient striker, Danny Chavez. You'll see a good amount of fakes, a good amount of feints. He looks to time his shots. And from the grappling perspective, from the ground game perspective, he does have some experience down there. He is a BJJ black belt. Looking at Kai Kamaka, on the other hand, he lost in his last fight. That was versus TJ Brown back in May. That was a split decision. And Kai Kamaka is now on a 2-fight losing streak after looking like a pretty promising prospect, earlier in his career. So definitely look for that to be a factor. Look for him to come out pretty hungry in this fight. Kai Kamaka is a very well-rounded fighter. He's introduced as a boxer and a wrestler, and that's kind of been the magic 1-2 punch in the UFC lately. So, definitely has that skill set on paper. Good striking, good kickboxing, sharp hands, pretty crisp boxer as well. Again, to that point, solid counter puncher. Uses that front leg for push kicks and knees. So look for that to potentially be a factor in this fight. And he does show me some speed in his combinations as well. So I do like what I see from Kai Kamaka on the feet. And again, from that wrestling ability, he has an especially good single leg takedown. So I look for that to potentially be a factor in this fight as well. But I do think for the most part, although both of these guys have some ability on the ground, I do think this fight will stay on the feet. And then when I think about Danny Chavez, he allowed Jared Gordon to come forward and control center in that last fight. I can see Kai Kamaka doing something very similar versus Danny Chavez. Top control for Kai Kamaka could be a factor in this fight if he does happen to land that single leg. Can definitely steal around with some top control there. Ultimately, I'm going to go with Kai Kamaka. I'm going to go with Kai Kamaka. I think when you think about solid fighters who are on losing streaks, they make for dangerous opponents, especially when you can assume or at least anticipate that he's fighting for his job. And I think that is the case here with Kai Kamaka at 1.8-2. He's now sitting at 8-4, in a threat to go 8-5 after being a pretty promising prospect. So I think that hunger will allow him to get the job done. Kai Kamaka III is going to be my pick. Let's move on to fight number 6. We have Gruetzemacher taking on Rafa García. I'll keep this one really short. Gruetzemacher, he lost Alexander Hernandez back in October 2020. Older fighter at this point, 35 years old. He's more toughness than skill at this point in his career. On the feet, he likes to walk you down. Pretty flat-footed, pretty slow. Definitely has some pop. But again, not really too much to say beyond that. I don't think he really offers much else beyond that. Rafa García, on the other hand, he lost his UFC debut. That was his first loss of his career. That was versus Nasrat Haqparast back in March. And Rafa García was coming off of a short notice. So can't be too mad at that. Nasrat Haqparast, of course, is a beast. And listen, Rafa García was definitely holding his own in that fight. Decent stand-up. You'll see him pressure. You'll see him control center of the octagon. Keeps his hands up on the feet. Decent counter-striking ability. Good fakes and feints and level changes. Definitely has that pop, very comfortable on the feet. Physically strong. He can hold you against the cage. Good shoots. I can definitely see him attempting and landing takedowns. And when we look at his record at 12 wins, 7 of them have come by submission. Right. So ultimately, again, keeping this one really short, I think Rafa García is better than Gruetzemacher everywhere, on the feet, on the ground, toughness, age, youth, ability, explosiveness, speed, etc. So this is probably one of my most confident picks on the card. Rafa García, I think he's going to get the job done here. I'm not too worried about Gruetzemacher beating him instead. So let's move on to fight number 7. Fight number 7, we have Collin Anglin taking on Melsik Baghdasaryan. This is an interesting fight. This is a very interesting fight. Collin Anglin, he is making his UFC debut. He last fought in the Dana White Contender Series, and that was way back in September 2020. So approaching a year since his last fight. That was versus Muhammadjon Naimov. He's on a 7-fight win streak. Collin Anglin, again, we see his record there at 8-1. 7-fight win streak, a bit awkward on the feet. The hands stay low, tries to make it hard for his opponents to time him. A lot of feints in the stand-up, good movements as well. Almost reminds me a bit of like an Alexander Hernandez type of fighter on the feet, but to some degree, minus the activity. I know he has a significant strikes landed per minute number there, but that, of course, that's only in one UFC fight. Can't really use that as an accurate barometer. And again, that's a Dana White Contender Series fight, which does count towards UFC stats. But again, I feel like he doesn't really have the activity that an Alexander Hernandez type of fighter has, but reminds me a lot of an Alexander Hernandez type of fighter on the feet. In terms of his clinch and ground game, good clinch, high school wrestling background. He can definitely land those takedowns. Pretty good on top, good ground and pound, good activity on top. And he has that other gear, it doesn't really show it consistently enough for me, but he can definitely turn it up a notch if and when needed. Thinking about Melsik Baghdasaryan, on the other hand, it is his UFC debut as well. He also has a Dana White Contender Series win back in September 2020, and he is on a 5-fight win streak in his own right. So very similar paths here. Again, creating for a very interesting prelim fight here. He's a southpaw on the feet, pushes a really good pace, almost like a controlled aggression. Very light on the feet, quick striker, quick kicks, good jab, good power, especially good power. Very high-level kickboxer. And I think he's pretty good in the clinch too. He throws a very effective and explosive elbows and knees in the clinch, has a nasty left elbow in general. He can definitely control opponents against the cage. and he does have some takedowns. Not really known for his takedowns, more so known for his kickboxing. But East European man, I think he has some natural wrestling in him. So maybe look for that to be kind of an undocumented factor in this fight to see what he can do versus Collin Anglin. So the interesting thing about Baghdasaryan, he definitely slows down after the first round. Still effective, but definitely slows down. I think Baghdasaryan has the better stand-up than Collin Anglin does. I think Collin Anglin perhaps has the better ground game than Baghdasaryan does. But it's hard to know the level that either of these fighters are on. Again, both of these guys are making their UFC debuts. Both of them were on Dana White Contender Series. Hard to really know what level they're truly at. If I think about how this fight could go, I think Baghdasaryan could potentially hurt him. Whereas I don't quite see Anglin controlling this fight on the ground. So I think Baghdasaryan is more likely to have his way than Anglin having his way. So as a result of that, minus 150, Melsik Baghdasaryan. I wouldn't be surprised if he comes in and perhaps gets a first round finish. He is pretty explosive early on in that fight. But even if he doesn't, he's still going to be my pick, Melsik Baghdasaryan. Moving on to fight number 8, we have Nicco Montaño taking on Wu Yanan. Again, interesting fight, a somewhat difficult fight, a somewhat unpredictable fight. Looking at Nicco Montaño, 5-3, we see her record there. She last fought way back in July 2019. I mean, we see a very old picture of there holding a title. That kind of tells you the last time that she competed. That was again back in July 2019. She lost that fight to Juliana Pena. Since then, she's had 4 canceled fights in 2020, 1 canceled fight back in February 2021. And I mean, here we finally are for her landing a fight in July versus Wu Yanan. So, I mean, she's been trying, but she just hasn't been active. Switch stance fighter. She does throw from a lot of different angles, a pretty diversified attack on the feet, pretty fluid as well, decent clinch. She's pretty strong. She can hold you against the cage. She can land those takedowns. Pretty good control on top. I like her pressure. I like her activity. I like her ground and pound. And she has some pretty good takedown defense as well. If we think about that fight versus Juliana Pena, she gave Pena a lot of problems in that first round. And Juliana Pena is now someone who's fighting for the title in this bantamweight division. So it kind of lets you know who Nicco Montaño is, or at least was, as a fighter, somebody who could potentially be in, say, the top 10 of the division and perhaps make some noise. Yanan Wu, on the other hand, she lost a unanimous decision to Jocelyn Edwards back in January. She's now 1-3 in the UFC after coming in as a 10-1 prospect. Still pretty young. She's just 25 years old. Pretty good, quick combination striking from her. Pretty light on her feet. Good movement around the cage as well. Pretty solid in the clinch against the cage. Some okay takedowns from her perspective as well. And, I've seen her when she's on her back, at least threaten some submissions, threaten the triangle, threaten the arm bar. So that could potentially be a factor allowing her to get back up and making this a stand-up fight again. Like I said, pretty tough fight. If I look at that Wu Yanan fight versus Jocelyn Edwards, what that showed us is that Yanan Wu is not really the best at handling pressure. I don't think Yanan Wu is just quite there yet. I think Montaño, I should say, I think she's going to have the better game plan. I think she's going to be the physically stronger fighter. I think she's going to use that clinch against the cage to ultimately win rounds, if not take it to the ground and control on the ground and look to land points in that way. And I think although Nicco Montaño probably is not better on the feet, I think her style will be a little bit more effective, again, at least earlier in the fight. So, Yanan Wu, tough matchup for her. I don't think she'll get it done. I think Nicco Montaño is going to pull off the W here after a 2-year layoff. Let's move on to our final fight of our prelims. Niklas Stolze taking on Mounir Lazzez. Stolze, he lost to Ramazan Amiv. That was way back of July last year, July 2020. That was his UFC debut at the time. His background, again, I like to pay attention to how he's introduced in the ring. He's introduced as a kickboxer and a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner. Pretty sharp calf kicks on the feet. Really good movement, especially earlier in the fight, and especially laterally. Really good lateral movement. A bit of a switch stance out of him. Good kickboxer, like I mentioned. He showed me some takedown defense in that Amiv fight as well. Mounir Lazzez, somewhat of a similar fighter. He did lose to Warley Alves. That was back in January. Of course, we know Alves came out very explosive. I'll talk about that a bit later. Mounir Lazzez, very comfortable and composed on the feet. I like his kicks. Good knees in the stand-up as well. Good footwork, clean kickboxing. Pretty diverse striker. Definitely goes for accuracy rather than power. And he has, sort of some consistent output. And I've seen him land the takedowns, right? I mean, we see his takedown averages there, 3.41 per fight, 100% takedown accuracy, smaller sample size, but nonetheless, it does let you know that he has that ability. And I have seen some takedown defense from him as well. I mentioned the Lazzez loss to Warley Alves. He lost that fight because Alves came out with an extremely explosive pace. I don't think Niklas Stolze has that kind of pace in him or has that kind of explosive power in him. So I don't see that kind of event repeating itself, that Lazzez versus Alves fight. I look at this as something as a little bit more methodical, a little bit more technical. These guys taking a little bit more time to read each other. And, it's going to be a close fight. I think it's going to stay on the feet. I think it's ultimately going to be a kickboxing match. And when I think about it from that perspective, I think Lazzez is just a bit cleaner on the feet in terms of his kickboxing. And I also think his cardio is going to hold up a bit better as, again, he goes at a bit more of a consistent pace. Whereas Stolze, from what I've seen, sort of slows down as the fight goes on. So I'm not even too mad at that minus 200. I think Lazzez has some okay value there. I wish he was maybe a minus 160, would have been all over it. But at minus 200, I'm not too mad at that. I do think he is the slightly better fighter. I'm going to take this to Vegas in that case, and I'm going to take a look at which fights I am considering from both the underdog and from the favorite or parlay perspective. So if I'm looking at some underdogs, I know there was quite a few of them that I mentioned in this video. From a betting perspective, I would potentially be interested in betting on Philip Rowe versus Orion Cosce. You see him there at plus 150. And got to go with the gut and got to go with Trevin Jones at a plus 130. So two potential underdogs that could get the job done versus their respective opponents. And if I'm thinking about some parlay action or maybe a favorite pick or two, I definitely want to include Rafa García in that conversation. And although it's going to be somewhat of a tough fight, bit of a gut check here. I'm going with Melsik Baghdasaryan at minus 150. And we see there that's going to be a plus 127. $100 will return 227 for our bigger bettors. $250 will return a healthy 568. So I am going to end off on that note as usual. Please help us out with all of that algorithmic stuff. Subscribe to the channel, press the thumbs up, hit the notification bell so you know when our next videos will be dropping, and participate in the comments. Let us know which underdog or two you are considering on the prelims. Let us know perhaps which favorite or two you're considering on the prelims. And if you have a prelim parlay, we'd love to give you some additional feedback and additional insights on that. So signing off again, Harris flying solo, giving you our UFC predictions and fight-by-fight breakdown for UFC Fight Night, Uriah Hall versus Strickland, aka UFC Vegas 33. Let's get this money.